Trade deputies from the United States and China are expected to meet to discuss negotiations over the active trade battle between the two countries. The talks follow the delay of proposed tariffs on $300 billion worth of Chinese-made products.
So while the president has received criticism for his handling of the situation with China, Democratic presidential candidate, former Vice President Joe Biden, has taken a lot of heat for downplaying the country's threat. Here to expand on this is Zaid Jilani. He writes about polarization for UC Berkeley and Greater Good Science Center, and he's also the co-host of the podcast Extremely Offline, something that I aspire to. Zaid.
Yeah, we're envious of that.
I am. Zaid, the reason that I wanted to have you on the show is you had this amazing thread about the history of how Joe Biden kind of has really been swept up in this neoliberal outlook on China. So just take us through like a history of him on China policy. Where does it all begin, and really what are the core fundamentals of his belief here?
Yeah, so this is something that he's talked about, particularly when he's vice president, is that going back to the 1970s, Biden was an advocate for greater ties with China and greater trade with China. When a lot of people were advocating for a closed-off policy towards China, he said, no, a rising China is good for the United States, good for the rest of the world. And this culminated in 2000 when the U.S. Congress voted to give China permanent normal trade relations, meaning that they get basically a free trade agreement that doesn't have to be renewed every year based on human rights or other conditions. Biden went to the floor and said something like, you know, this country has a GDP the size of Netherlands. There's not going to be any competitor to us. You know, our manufacturing sector is going to be fine. I don't foresee a collapse there. It's going to lead to greater social and political freedom as people, you know, get more markets and things in China. And so therefore, you know, Biden was totally on the side of kind of the converse of where Trump is in terms of opening up to China, trading with China, thinking it wasn't much of a threat to sort of the U.S. role in the U.S. economy. And obviously, under the Trump presidency, and I think also we're seeing this for some of the Democratic side, like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, these folks were on the other side of that question.
We have a little bit of Joe Biden back in 2011, sort of embracing the view that you're talking about. Let's take a listen.
As a young member of the Foreign Relations Committee, I wrote and I said, and I believe then what I believe now, that a rising China is a positive development, not only for China, but for America and the world writ large.
What's remarkable about that statement is, based on your thread, I also looked back and I went to go look at the speech that he gave for normalizing trade relations and for voting for NAFTA, and he talked about how there was this factory in Delaware that was going to have all these new cars that they were going to sell to Mexico. Yeah, that factory closed in 2007, and it's incredible to me because in 2011 he still believed this stuff.
So wait, what you're saying is this was not in fact a positive development.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is that I think you can make a case that this increased trade with China did benefit China. I mean, they brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in China. Unfortunately, when U.S. politicians were making this case in the 1990s, they were saying it was going to be good for America. They were saying that it was going to lead to an export boom from the United States, and many of them made the case that there'd be more political freedom in China now than there was then, and there hasn't been any. If anything, now China is the world's most powerful dictatorship with the most sophisticated surveillance state. It is imprisoning Muslim citizens by the millions in labor camps and re-educating them. I mean, this is not the behavior of the free society that we were promised when all this went down.
And using modern technology with some American backing, by the way, to be able to target those religious minorities, to put them in those camps. And I think an important point here is that it's not like no one was able to see that this could be the result, right? You had Bernie Sanders, you had others who very accurately predicted exactly the route and the path that this was going to take.
Exactly. I mean, Sanders actually held a press conference alongside Nancy Pelosi, who also opposed permanent normal trade relations, which she's a longtime China critic. And Sanders actually read off lists of Clinton donors, Bill Clinton donors, explained that this was basically on top of the corporate wish list at the time. And he said that, you know, this would lead to basically a decline in manufacturing in the United States, a decline in a lot of sort of living standards for a lot of Americans. And I think looking back at that, to a lot of Americans, particularly in parts of the country where manufacturing was strong, I think that really rings true to them.
Well, and that's the thing, is that for corporations, it has been a good thing, right? And that's why you've seen the consensus lasted, and a bipartisan consensus having lasted for so long.
Well, I think, you know, part of it is that all of this was sort of sold on the dream of cheap goods, right? You know, we're going to get cheap stuff from China, particularly consumer electronics, but also furniture, apparel, clothing. And the question is that the only goal that we should have in terms of U.S. policy? Should we disregard things like human rights? Should we disregard things like the living standards of many of our own American people who no longer are part of the supply chain for many of the goods that we consume, right? I think that if your total goal was just to get the cheapest stuff possible, maybe you could say it was a win.
Yeah.
But there are other there are other principles at work here that Americans value.
That's what we talk about here all the time, which is stuff is cheaper than ever. But like you said, American citizens are not part of the supply chain for the very goods that they consume. We're sold this the whole story about comparative advantage and the dream of modern society. Oh, everybody's home is bigger, people living longer. It's kind of this Steven Pinker kind of outlook on the world. But I mean, you study this. We have never been more polarized as a society than ever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's part of what culminated in sort of Trump's trade war with China, in that he had kind of had a chip on his shoulder about China for 30 years. No one was really addressing it, so I think he's addressing it in a somewhat blunt way with kind of across-the-board tariffs. But we're looking at 3 or 4 presidencies now that didn't address it at all, that basically just sold everyone on the pipe dream of very, very cheap goods from China that would lead to political freedom, and did not lead to political freedom, and it led to very disastrous economic consequences for a lot of Americans. And I think that's what culminated in part of this Trump phenomenon, which is kind of tied into a kind of very heavy-handed nationalism.
Well, and the hollowness of thinking that a bunch of cheaply made Chinese plastic crap is going to make us happy. I mean, that's what basically our policy has served to facilitate as a core value within our society. And no surprise that people are miserable.
Right. Zaid, you also had a very interesting Twitter thread yesterday about, there's controversy right now about the New York Times' decision to write the 1619 Project, the history of American slavery, and the scar of the eternal scar on the American nation. And I think you made an important point here, which is that the problem with tracing problems back in the U.S. back to slavery is that a lot of problems actually got much worse post-1960s than they were pre-1960s. There were a lot of powerful social phenomena and public policy mistakes that made things worse that are much more impactful now. You point to the basically implosion of black wealth under Barack Obama's presidency and how it's very difficult for a lot of the media to grapple with that. Talk about those policies in particular and how you're looking at this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think that studying history is very important. It's something every society should do. Societies that don't do it don't prosper. But I think there is a mistake being made here where I think a lot of the articles, at least that have been so far released in this series, have transposed things that happened 200 years ago as being more impactful than things that happened 10, 15 years ago. Yeah. For instance, you can talk about slavery with respect to black wealth. It certainly had importance over centuries, but black wealth actually had recovered fairly well going into the 1990s, especially with home ownership. But it was mostly destroyed by the Great Recession and the Obama administration's response, which was mostly this is kind of to prop the banking sector back up the way it had been, without doing a whole lot for homeowners.
Without doing anything for homeowners. I mean,
that was much more impactful than anything that happened 200 years ago. And yet, when the New York Times writes an article about the racial wealth gap and puts the entire thing on slavery, it's kind of ignoring everything that happened recently. And I think partly it's just much more. Anyone can condemn a slave owner from 200 years ago or condemn the Jim Crow system from 50, 60 years ago. It's much more difficult to look at, a popular president like Barack Obama and say that he made a number of, alongside Tim Geithner and Eric Holder, made a number of policy errors that contributed to the current kind of crisis with black wealth.
Yeah, I think that is such a good point, something that Sagar in particular has been talking about here. It is much more uncomfortable and much more politically difficult to criticize someone who is not just, still very popular and still very much around to be able to hear that criticism, but is particularly popular with your subscribers of your paper.
Yeah, and I think, part of this is just that there is sort of a trend within particularly liberal media, I think, to often look at the history and to recount it and repeat it over and over. And I think, like I said, I think studying the history is important, but we need to be able to look squarely and honestly at contemporary public policy decisions. For instance, there was this flare-up about Baltimore, and of course Trump had very insulting rhetoric and remarks about Baltimore. But Baltimore has seen several police commissioners in a row resign, seen several mayors resign as a result of corruption. I mean, that's where a lot of the attention needs to be, is what are those public policy decisions being made today? How are those public officials behaving today? Because they can change a lot of this. We don't have to be trapped in a 200-year pattern of history if we make the correct decisions and have clean, honest, not corrupt officials running things today.
Yeah, I buy into the view of Dr. Cornel West that you can't talk about race without also looking at corporatism, militarism, that these things all tie together. And if you're just looking at one to the exclusion of everything else, you're missing a lot of the picture. Zaid, great to have you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zaid. Really appreciate it. Next on Rising, China's tech giant Huawei gets an extra 90 days before they face a ban in the United States.
Cybersecurity expert and friend of the show Nate Snyder provides context on how that ban got implemented in the first place when Rising returns.